All right, so welcome to our Wednesday live class session. Today we're going to be talking about American Empire and specifically why 1898 is a really important year in the conversation over American Empire. But we kind of want to take a couple steps backward, I think. If we're going to be talking about the idea of empire, it might be helpful to define what exactly an empire is. Can anybody take a stab at defining what does the word empire mean? Now, you don't necessarily need to give me the dictionary definition, but if somebody asks you what's an empire, what would you tell them? Anybody want to volunteer? Yes, Lavender.
I would describe an empire as like any government or like what's the word? Yeah, kind of like a government that spans over like a large amount of space. So maybe multiple continents. They're not all connected. Kind of. I don't know. That's what I would say.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good working definition, right? It's a very large control of territory, right? Not necessarily territory that's all next to each other. Okay, I think that's a good criteria for empire, right? You're controlling other entities, right? So there's also that suggestion empire, right? That you may be controlling groups of people who are not like you. Okay. So if we take that as the definition of empire, first of all, is America an empire? Are we an empire today? Raise your hand if you think the United States is an empire today in 2021 at the time of recording. All right, Mary, Lavender, Marissa. Okay, so everybody agrees America is an empire. Okay. So if we agree America is an empire today, here's the big question. When did we become an empire? When? Anybody have any guesses? Want to toss out a time period or date for when we became an empire? Lavender, go for it.
When we gained Hawaii and Alaska.
Okay, when we gained Hawaii and Alaska. So Hawaii was added in 1898 and Alaska was added in 1868. Okay. How about you, Mary? I saw you had your hand up.
I was thinking just like basically when we started gaining control of North America, like just the continent, since we were basically like conquesting the Native Americans. So
okay. All right. So you go back even earlier. Marissa chimed in the chat. She chimed in 1880s, so kind of similar time frame to Lavender. And then Mary's like, hold the phone. Like, we need to go back early, right? So in Mary's suggestion, then we would kind of pin becoming empire to when the United States became a nation, right? So then we would pin it towards 1776, right? So these are all very common dates that people suggest, everything that you guys guessed, right? These are dates that different people look at. And in particular, 1898, the year that we gained Hawaii, but also several other possessions, as we'll talk about today, is really important because it's the first time we gained significant territory outside of the continent. But as Mary mentioned, because we are literally conquering Native American peoples as we expand across the continent, that does make us an empire. Even though it's still, this connected form of land, there are people that we're literally conquering. So there are a lot of folks that say, okay, well, if empire means conquering other people that aren't like you, then definitely the beginning of the United States. There are other people who go, well, maybe we should talk about empire when the United States expands outside of the continent, in which case Alaska, as Lavender mentioned, would be the first instance of that, right, in 1868. So there are a bunch of different dates that people toss out, but 1898 is really important regardless of where you stand on when they start. Because 1898 is a year in which the American empire definitely flexes its muscles and expands a lot further than it had before. So we're going to focus kind of on mostly 1898 and its aftermath today, but we are going to talk a little bit about expansion in general. But 1898 is really a pivot point for the United States, not only in the number of territories it gains, but also the population in those territories. All right. So if we're going to talk about American imperialism, and particularly we're going to talk about the impact of the War of 1898 or the Spanish-American, Philippine, Puerto Rican, et cetera, war, which is why I just call it the War of 1898, then we're going to have to rewind a little bit and talk about what's going on in a global context. Part of my training as a historian is in world history, which is somewhat unusual for a U.S. historian. Normally, U.S. historians are kind of the redheaded stepchild of world history. In fact, when I sat in on, when I took my first world history class in graduate school, we had to go around the table and introduce each other. And Jerry Bentley, who was this titan in the field of world history, like a rock star. And when I introduced myself as a specialist in U.S. history, he looked at me and was like, "Why are you here?" Because most of the time, if you study U.S. history, you're not as concerned with what's going on outside. So I'm kind of the weirdo who was. So I always like to talk, and thankfully, U.S. historians are moving that way. Because I think it's a more important way to understand American history, right? That there are some things that are unique about us, but there are also some things that we're really shaped by what's going on in the larger world. So for the United States, we are not the only nation that is undergoing this desire to expand, especially in the 1800s. There's this phenomenon within world history called new imperialism, to differentiate it from the stuff we talk about in 1301, right? Like with the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the English initially colonizing North America. That's old imperialism. New imperialism is imperialism that is made possible by the Industrial Revolution, right? All these new technologies that make it easier to conquer far-flung colonies. So advances in transportation, like the railroad and steamships, and communication, like the telegraph, in weaponry, right, like the rifle, and other kinds of advances. These make it easier for nations to conquer other places and to manage empires that are spread out across the world. So some of the empires that were powerful in the first wave, the old imperialism wave, are still popular, are still adding territory. For example, the British Empire, this is the time period in which that phrase, "the sun never sets in the British Empire," is true, and that they control so much territory across the world. The French are also expanding during this time, but what's interesting about new imperialism is you have some new power players on the scene. So you have some new nations that are really excited and trying to play catch up to these older imperial powers. So the United States is one of them. But also we see Germany and Italy, which are not unified until the 1870s. So in other words, what we today know as Germany and Italy were not unified nation states until the 1870s. They were a bunch of smaller little pieces of states. Japan, which your textbook in History 1301 mentions Matthew Perry, Commodore Matthew Perry, right, of the U.S. Navy opening Japan. Japan very quickly becomes modernized with the Meiji Restoration in the late 1860s. So they want to compete on the world scene. They don't want to be conquered like some of the other Asian nations, like China is really dominated by foreign powers. So all of these relatively young nation states want a piece of the pie. They want to be competitive in global politics, and the way to do that is to have an empire. And where's my mouse? Where are you, mouse? There it is. All right. Okay. So the motives for the United States expanding, some of these motives will be very similar to other foreign powers and their desire for expansion. Others will be uniquely American. So when we look at American motives for expansion, a lot of it is economic, right? We talked about in History 1301 how the United States really wanted a presence more on the West Coast. So in other words, we wanted California, right? And started the War of the Mexican-American War, right, in 1848, 46 to 48, to get California, the Western territories, because of the ability to trade overseas with Asia, right? So the United States really sees the East, the old East, right, as a place where they can make money. What do they want to trade in Asia? Any ideas? Sorry if you can hear my husband in the background. He's a very loud voice. What do Americans want to get from Asia? Any ideas? Think back to History 1301. A lot of this stuff is still true. What do we want out of Asia? What do we want to get from Asia? Silk, yes. Luxury products like silk. Remember, like spices, right? Porcelain. So all of these like products that are unique to Asia. What about now, however, we also have this desire to sell our products to them, right? Because think about it, China in particular is this huge market. They haven't fully industrialized yet, but they have millions of people, right? Think about all the products they could buy from American manufacturers. And in fact, China is kind of the big target when we're looking at Asia. You can see this in this political cartoon from this time period, right? This is a French cartoon, which is why China is spelled that way. It looks like they're carving up a pizza. Although this is a little early for pizza. Pizza's not quite been invented yet at the publication of this cartoon. So China obviously is in the background. They're objecting to it being carved up. Can you identify who these people are? Do you recognize any? They're all representing different nations. How about this lady on the left? Anybody know who she is or what nation she's representing? Yes, the Queen, Queen Victoria of England, right? Great Britain. How about this dude in the pointy helmet? What nation is he representing? Any ideas? Deutschland, Germany. It's Otto von Bismarck. Okay, my homeland. All right, then we have over here, how about this guy? He looks different from everybody else, right? Do you have any idea who he is? What nation he's representing? Think about some of the power players we mentioned last slide.
French or Spain?
That's a good guess. French would be back here. The lady, because France is very often depicted as a lady. This is actually Japan. Okay, so you can kind of see his complexion is closer to China than the others. And then I can't tell, I can never remember whether this is Russia or Belgium. So take your pick. So basically the idea is, right, these European powers plus Japan are trying to carve up China because they want the markets. Notice the United States is not in this political cartoon, right? We don't have Uncle Sam at this table. This is going to be something that the Americans try to change. All right, so we have this desire for trade. Then there's also the political motivations for expansion. You guys remember, those of you who took 1301, what is manifest destiny? Anybody remember what is manifest destiny? Right, we're getting big shrugs. Everyone's like, you know what? I just obliterated everything from History 1301 over winter break. So manifest destiny is this belief that we are destined to expand across the continent, right? That was the original idea of manifest destiny, that we are destined to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And as we talked about last week in our class session, what happens when there's no more frontier, right? Is manifest destiny just dead? No, we change it. We just say we're destined to expand. We just drop the to the Pacific part. Okay, so we still believe that we're destined to expand, right? Because we as a nation, we have freedom and liberty and wouldn't everybody want to be like Americans? Okay, so there's this desire to spread American ideas, particularly our political system, across the world. And then there's also, again, this kind of desire to be a major global power. And we can see this with a very influential book. It's not the most exciting read, I will tell you, but it's very influential. The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Admiral Alfred Mahan. So Mahan, his book is extremely influential on multiple presidents, just to let you know, especially if their last name is Roosevelt. So Mahan, in his book, is arguing that if you want to be a global power player, you got to have a large modern navy with many overseas bases of operation. Okay? So for Mahan, basically he's saying if you want to be where the action is globally, you've got to kind of be present, right, in all these different places, and also have the muscle to flex if you need to. And it's really important to look at when he's publishing this book, because it's 1890. This is about the time that the frontier is being declared closed, right? His book is going to deeply influence the foreign policy of President Benjamin Harrison, whose Secretary of State moves to acquire ports and military bases in places like Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. It's also going to be deeply influential to both Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, okay, who both become president later. Yes, they are related. They are distant cousins. Okay, so this will not be the last time we talk about Mahan. Okay. All right. Then there's the cultural motivations for expansion. So if we talk about how in the ways in which America is unique, but also similar to other nations, a lot of the economic and political motives that in the United States are very similar to other nations that are expanding. The cultural motives is where we get a little bit more unique. So one is the sense of nationalism. So nationalism is this sense of pride in your nation and in identifying with your nation. So kind of similar to patriotism. But nationalism traditionally is this shared identity based on a common culture, a common ethnic heritage, a common language or religion or history. Can the United States easily pin our identity to any of those things? We're a nation of immigrants, right? We don't have a common language or culture or ethnic heritage. We're all very different. So nationalism in the United States instead becomes this belief in the American political story, right? Like our freedom and our democracy. Like this becomes what we identify as American nationalism, and we want to spread that. And this very aggressive form of wanting to spread American ideals happens in the 1890s in particular because we see the rise of a bunch of new immigrants that cause some concern over whether immigrants are going to ruin our American identity. The story stays the same. Just the group of immigrants that are going to ruin America changes every 20 years or so. There's this notion that the Americans need to expand because the economy keeps going down different points during the Gilded Age. So this drives a very aggressive form of American nationalism. But there's also the belief in this concept known as the white man's burden. I'm going to go forward a slide for a minute because the white man's burden is an important term to remember. So the white man's burden, it comes from this poem written by the British author Rudyard Kipling. Anybody familiar with Rudyard Kipling? What else? What did he publish that was more famous than this?
The Jungle Book?
The Jungle Book, right. Or my favorite, Rikki Tikki Tavi, about the mongoose. Yeah. All right. So Rudyard Kipling is pretty famous, right? This British author. And he publishes this poem, White Man's Burden, in 1899 in celebration of the American victory in the War of 1898. So these are just two verses that I pulled out of the larger poem. Okay. Now, some people are like, poetry interpretation, Dr. Esmacher, this is not English class. Okay, so to make it a little bit easier on you, let's first go to a political cartoon that also is about the white man's burden. And let's try to kind of figure out together what exactly the white man's burden is. So here's a political cartoon from the magazine Judge in 1899, trying to visually depict what Rudyard Kipling's poem talks about, the white man's burden. So what's going on in this image? Who do we see here? Who's the figure on the right? We have two dudes carrying baskets. Who's the figure on the right?
Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam?
Sorry. Didn't raise my hand. Sorry.
That's okay. Uncle Sam, yes. Okay, anybody have any idea who this guy is? On the left? No, okay, that's okay. We don't need to identify him yet. All right, now let's look at the basket Uncle Sam is carrying. What's going on with that basket? It's a bunch of people who are depicted not well, right? Lavender, any guesses?
I would guess they're either like Cubans or any other people that they, the other new Puerto Rico. Yeah. So I would guess people from there.
Yeah, so the idea is they're representing people that are from these new territories that the United States has, right? So like they helpfully label Cuba right on one of them, okay? So if we look at that then, and then look at this other basket, and the kind of people who are in here. Any guesses as to which colonial power that this guy might be? You have your hand up, Lavender. Are you willing to guess, or you forgot to put it down?
I forgot to put it down, but I can guess. I'm a good guess. English.
Yes. Yep, correct. Now, what are they trying to carry them towards? What's up here on the top of the mountain? Yes, Marissa.
Civilization.
Civilization, right. Okay, and what are they carrying them over? What do all these rocks say? Saying things like barbarism, ignorance, vice, brutality, slavery, right? So all of these rocks have different negative words on them, negative traits, right? So what's the message of this political cartoon then? Uncle Sam and then his British counterpart carrying baskets of these colonized people across these rocks, right, that have negative traits up towards this golden statue that's labeled civilization. What's the message here? Yes, Lavender.
The message is that these people from these Cuba and these other countries would face ignorance and all of that, and so they need the help of England and the United States to bring them to civilization. So they're helping them out by carrying this heavy load.
Right. So that's what the white man's burden is, right? It's their duty, it's their burden, right? Because these people don't look like they're the most cooperative, to bring them to civilization. Okay, that's what the white man's burden is. That's the duty of these white Western countries to civilize the rest of the world. And if we go back to look at Rudyard Kipling's poem, the couple of verses I pulled out here, it makes it sound like it's not a pleasant job, right? Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. Talking about your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child, right? Like it's not a flattering portrayal of the people that are being conquered, right? But it's saying it's your duty, right, as an evolved white person, to go out and to carry this out. So the white man's burden is a really powerful motivator for these white Western nations and a good excuse to colonize these people because we're helping them. We're helping them become more civilized by taking over their countries. We can see this have a religious bent in the United States, particularly with a Methodist evangelist named Dwight Moody, who founds the Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Missions. He inspires 8,000 American missionaries to go abroad to places like these new colonies and try to convert people to Protestant Christianity. Josiah Strachan is a Congregationalist minister who writes, a tract called Our Country, in which he argued that of all of the nations, the United States is best suited to carry out the white man's burden because of our sort of religious convictions, but also because of our unique system of government and American freedom. Okay. He also ties it into Manifest Destiny. All right. So the United States, as we mentioned at the beginning of this class, does engage in some interest in expansion outside of the continent, or outside of the lower 48 by acquiring Alaska in 1868. The United States had kind of flirted with adding other territories. We got the Midway Islands in the Pacific in 1867. But one of the territories that had long been on the radar for the United States was Hawaii. Okay, the Kingdom of Hawaii. Where is Hawaii on this map? You're like, this is a history class. Geography? It's not geography. Geography is important in history, folks. It's right here in the middle, that little tiny speck. That's the Hawaiian island chain, okay? The Hawaiian Islands are the most isolated island chain in the world. I can testify to that, having lived there for 7 years and having to pay plane tickets back and forth to visit family. It's expensive, okay, because it's isolated, it's out there. Americans have been interested in Hawaii very early on. In the 1820s, the first American missionaries went from New England all the way over to Hawaii to try to convert the Hawaiians to Protestant Christianity. They also wanted to westernize the Hawaiians, and they were very unhappy when the Hawaiians liked to incorporate some things they liked, but not others. Like, for example, Queen Ka'ahumanu, who would eventually become one of the first, like, really major converts to Christianity in Hawaii, loved the idea of top hats, which were in style, but she would wear them with the traditional women's dress in Hawaii, which was just a skirt. And the Americans were like, that's not how you do our clothing, right? You're still uncovered here. So missionaries had a great success in Hawaii. American missionaries did in converting members of the noble class or the elite. And many of them served as important advisors to Hawaiian chiefs and kings. And eventually the descendants of missionaries chose not to become missionaries themselves, but instead businessmen operating in, again, what is the independent kingdom of Hawaii. Where Hawaii was economically, by the time we get to the 1890s, is their really important center for producing sugar. So these descendants of American missionaries to Hawaii own these sugar plantations on the Hawaiian Islands. And because they are technically Americans living in a foreign nation, the United States government gives them a cut. Like, they don't have to pay to import their sugar to the United States like they normally would because they're in a foreign country, because they're like, oh, hey, you're Americans, that's fine. Okay, so they give them a deal on sugar. And sugar is extremely profitable. And the sugar plantations employ workers from all over the place. They employ not only Hawaiians, but also Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Okinawan, Portuguese immigrants from all over the place. So the sugar industry makes these sons of American missionaries very powerful economically. But one of the areas where they're not super powerful is in the government, because the Hawaiian kingdom is a constitutional monarchy. So kind of like what we see in England today, right? Like, there is a monarch, but there's also a representative form of government. And one of the things that these Americans wanted to do was to gain more power and control. They didn't like the idea that all these non-white people had more authority than them. In 1887, they get King Kalakaua to sign the Bayonet Constitution to basically force changes to the Hawaiian Constitution. That's why they called it the Bayonet Constitution. Kalakaua was forced to sign it. And these changes included disenfranchising or stripping the right to vote or political power from a lot of Native Hawaiians and giving more power to these white Americans. This was extremely unpopular in Hawaii. There was a lot of protests over this, including the fact that they also pressured Kalakaua to sign over rights to Pearl Harbor for an American naval base. And when King Kalakaua died, he was succeeded by one of his relatives, Queen Liliuokalani. fun fact, the Hawaiians oftentimes held elections for new king or queen. They did not just necessarily go via hereditary. So Queen Liliuokalani ascends to the throne of Hawaii, and she makes it very clear that she is going to undo the Bayonet Constitution and restore more democracy and more representation for Native Hawaiians to the Constitution. Queen Liliuokalani is then overthrown. She is removed from her seat of power by these Americans, and they imprison her in her own palace, Iolani, for a period of time, and they decide that they're going to establish a provisional government in Hawaii, and they immediately ask to be let into the United States. This sparks massive protest in Hawaii among the Hawaiians who go, "You have illegally overthrown the government of Hawaii and their queen." Grover Cleveland, who was the president at the time of the overthrow in 1893, says, "No, I will not add Hawaii to American territory." He was personal friends with Queen Liliuokalani, right? He's like, you've illegitimately undone the government of Hawaii. I don't recognize your authority, right? We're not going to talk. However, when William McKinley becomes president in 1898, he then recognizes the legitimacy of these Americans and their control of Hawaii and formally adds Hawaii to United States territory. This is a sore point for Hawaiians still today. There are a lot of people who argue that Hawaii is not legitimately a state because these Americans overthrew the legitimate ruler of Hawaii. All right, 1898 is a busy year for American adding territory. The War of 1898, also sometimes called the Spanish-American War, or again, like I just call it the War of 1898, so we don't have to put all of the geographical names in it. The War of 1898 happens because the Spanish Empire is crumbling. They are one of the old school empires that is not doing well, and they're facing independence movements and their few remaining colonies, most notably Cuba in the Caribbean and the Philippines in Asia. The Cuban independence movement had been going in stops and starts since 1868 and started to see a renewed push towards independence in 1895. And the Filipino independence movement had been going since 1896. So the Spanish are already fighting wars of independence against their colonies in Cuba and the Philippines. The United States gets dragged into this in part because of media. Okay, here's a legitimate time where we can blame media. So William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were like the two big media titans in the 1890s. They together ran separately. They were ardent competitors. They ran the most influential newspapers in the United States, like the New York Journal and the New York World. And they practiced a form of journalism that we call yellow journalism. In other words, and this was named after like the color of the print. They focused on things that sold. So like sex, crime, like the splashy bits, right, of news. So kind of consider them the forerunners of clickbait. And they really, really felt that this was the time for the United States to take advantage and seize Cuba. The United States had been dreaming of adding Cuba for decades at this point. Okay, so they really wanted the United States to get involved on the side of Cuba so that we could get control of Cuba. And when the USS Maine, a U.S. naval ship, exploded in the Havana harbor in Cuba in February of 1898, killing about 270 Americans, they immediately said that this explosion happened because the Spanish plotted against the Americans and didn't want the Americans involved. And so the Spanish had bombed the Maine. Spoiler alert, the Spanish had not. It was not an act of sabotage. Most likely it was the result of a faulty boiler. My dad is a metallurgical engineer who spends lots of times looking at boiler explosions. So I've often asked him to give his opinion on this. But that's the consensus of a lot of archaeologists as well, that that's what happened to the Maine. It was an accident. It was not sabotage. So the newspapers owned by Hearst and Pulitzer start, spreading this fake news story about how the Spanish had blown up this ship and that we should get involved to avenge the deaths of these Americans. And the United States government gets on board with this and passes the Teller Amendment that says that we felt we had a duty to help spread freedom and democracy to Cuba, and that we pinky swore we would not add Cuba to our territory, that we were getting involved for the goodness of the Cubans, not for our benefit. Okay. So we get involved in the War of 1898 because of this, and it oftentimes gets the nickname a splendid little war because it's a very short war as it goes. It was only 4 months long and relatively low casualties. Okay, only about 400 Americans died in this conflict. So the War of 1898 is fought on two fronts, in the Pacific and the Caribbean. In the Pacific, Admiral George Dewey defeats the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay in the Philippines, gaining control there. And we also fight on the ground together with the Philippine independence movement. In the Caribbean, we're fighting the Spanish in both Cuba and Puerto Rico. Probably the most famous battle of the War of 1898 is the Battle of San Juan Hill, made famous in part because Teddy Roosevelt writes an account of this battle in his memoirs, which he published right after the war was done. So Teddy Roosevelt had served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigned his post so he could enlist in the Army when the war broke out, and he recruited his own company, a group he nicknamed the Rough Riders, which was a cross-section of his buddies from back east, his buddies from his cowboy days in the West, Native Americans. Ironically, the Rough Riders did not include any African Americans. And when he gave his account of the Battle of San Juan Hill in his memoirs, he conveniently left out that the Rough Riders were preceded up the hill by an African American unit and kind of paved the way for them. So the memoirs of his wartime experience is part of what catapulted Roosevelt after the War of 1898 in politics. He becomes elected to the governor's office of New York in 1898, and then eventually is tapped as vice president in 1900. I could talk about Teddy Roosevelt a lot because he's one of my favorite characters. He's very colorful. But basically, he got put into the vice president position because people felt that at the time that was where your political career went to die. So the Republican Party was trying to contain Roosevelt and put him in a position that didn't have a lot of power. And then William McKinley got assassinated and Roosevelt became president anyways. So that's a story for another day, but it's a really interesting kind of story. All right. So the war ends after only 4 months. Spain declares defeat. And in the treaty, Cuba gets its freedom, but Spain gives Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, an island in the Pacific, to the United States. So those now become American territories. Now, even though Cuba gets its independence, Cuba as a new nation is relatively vulnerable to outside forces. And that was something that one of the leaders of the Cuban independence movement, Jose Marti, was afraid of. Marti, who was killed in 1895 and part of this independence movement, famously said, "To change masters is not to be free." So in other words, if we replace Spanish dominance with, say, American dominance, has our situation really improved? The United States forced Cuba to add an amendment to their constitution called the Platt Amendment that basically said the United States could send in their military whenever they wanted. So we required the Cubans, again, an independent government, to put that in, that we could just show up with our military whenever we wanted. And the bitterness over this amendment is eventually what helps fuel the Cuban Revolution in 1959. American businessmen also get perks for being involved in Cuba. They basically run the show. Cuba will devolve into a dictatorship. And the United States retains control of naval bases, most notably Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. So Cuba's independent, but still effectively controlled economically and politically by the United States. So American involvement in the Philippines. The Philippines were shocked when the terms of the treaty became known, because they also, like the Cubans, had been fighting for independence, and yet they were not given independence. Emilio Aguinaldo who was the leader of the independence movement, who had fought alongside Americans during the war, was shocked that the United States did not recognize the independence of the Philippines. I mean, the Philippines had even already issued their own Declaration of Independence and an attempt at a constitution that looked very much like ours, or modeled after ours. So because the United States refused to let the Philippines be free on the argument of they weren't civilized enough, this started the Philippine-American War, which is a lot longer and bloodier than the War of 1898 was. So about 100,000 Filipinos, about 4,200 Americans die in this conflict of the United States trying to assert control over the Philippines. There's a high level of atrocities committed by American troops. This was an age before widespread censorship, and so like some of these atrocities are described in horrifying detail in American newspapers because there's no attempt to filter by the U.S. government what's going on. In the end, the U.S. government succeeds in wrangling control of the Philippines. They appoint William Howard Taft to be Governor General of the Philippine colony in 1901. There are millions of people in the Philippines. So adding the Philippines as a territory vastly changes the game for the United States. It's a huge population. Americans believed it was their duty to uplift and civilize and Christianize Filipinos. Why is it ironic that they want to spread Christianity in the Philippines? Anybody know what the majority religion is in the Philippines still today? Most of them are Catholic, which is a kind of Christianity. But they're like, no, that's not the right kind of Christianity. Protestant Christianity, that's what we want. Okay. There's also a substantial Muslim population in the Philippines, but Catholicism is still the dominant one. So the Americans set to work kind of trying to modernize the infrastructure in the Philippines, including railroads, harbors, healthcare system, American-style education, at the same time, you know, not really involving the Filipinos, right, in these improvements or in these governments. They don't really have a say. Okay, they are literally conquered people. The United States also tries to expand into other areas after they've acquired these new territories. Like, for example, into China, they declare the open door policy, meaning we want a piece of that pie that we saw earlier, right? We want to be able to trade in China, which had been carved into these spheres of influence that different nations had control of different ports. The other nations were not really excited about the open door policy until the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion was a movement by more traditional Chinese people who were upset at the degree of Western influence and control over their nation, and so they rose up in rebellion and they targeted foreigners, but also converts to American Christianity. The United States sent in troops to help quell the Boxer Rebellion, and at that point, then other Western nations became more friendly in allowing the United States a presence to trade in China because they had helped defend these foreign embassies. Now, acquiring all of these territories, including the United States will also about this time purchase Wake Island and American Samoa, both in the Pacific as well. Acquiring all of these territories brings in a question. Because traditionally, what happened when we added a territory to the United States? Did they remain permanent territories? Like, think of like when we added the Northwest Territory or the Louisiana Purchase or the stuff we acquired from the War of 1890, or excuse me, the Mexican-American War. What happened to those territories? Yes, Lavender.
They became states and became part of permanent.
Right, they became states. There was this process set out in the Constitution, right, whereby it says, here's the criteria for territories moving to statehood, and usually it was like once your population hit a certain number, then you'd have a provisional government, and then you'd start to draft a state constitution, and then petition to become a state, right? That had always been the way it went. If you were a territory, eventually you'd become a state. Now this process is disrupted. Now we have, I mean, like if you look at the Philippines, again, on population alone, they qualify, right? So here's the question. If we have these territories, what do we do with them? Because if we allowed them to become states, why might Americans at this time be nervous about adding Hawaii or the Philippines or Puerto Rico as states? Any ideas? Why would they not want to add these territories as states? Yes, Lavender.
Once the territories are states, they'll have the right to vote, and so then, I don't know, they'll have a different agenda than the people in the mainland. So,
right, all of a sudden, all of these brown people will have the right to vote. Okay, that really scared a lot of white Americans, especially the Philippines, because the population is so big. So there's that concern, right? That they're going to have different priorities, right? They're going to have equal representation in Congress, right? In addition to the voting power at home. So there's this concern, right? That if we felt the Philippines weren't ready for prime time to become independent, surely we don't believe they're ready to become a state within the United States. Okay. But at the same time, okay, we're nervous about adding them as states. But if we don't give them that option, if they remain territories, are we really still a republic? Because in territories, the Constitution does not apply the same as it does in a state. So this becomes the problem, right? How do we address this? And the United States passes the Foraker Act in 1900, which formally creates a new kind of territory to disrupt this traditional path from territory to statehood. So now territories like Puerto Rico become known as insular territories, which means that Puerto Ricans are citizens of Puerto Rico, not the United States, and that Puerto Rico will not have that automatic path to statehood. That if they want to become a state, there's a whole different process now. Okay, so basically we create this whole new territory, like this whole new label of territory for this. Well, then that becomes tricky. Now we've created this permanent territory. What rules do apply and don't apply to territories? And so if somebody asks you today why Puerto Ricans cannot vote for president of the United States, even though Puerto Rico is a territory, the answer you can tell them is oranges. The reason Puerto Ricans can't vote for president is oranges. Now, that's a simplification, but the insular cases, that a collection of cases the Supreme Court heard from 1901 to 1904, one of the most important cases was over oranges. In particular, if oranges from Puerto Rico are transported to the American mainland, do they have to pay an import tax? Puerto Ricans said, no, we are American territory. Our oranges do not have to pay an import tax, and we transport them to the mainland. Citrus growers in Florida said yes, because Puerto Rico is not a state. It is not fully part of America. They should have to pay import taxes. So that was one of the cases brought before the Supreme Court. You can't vote for president. There's you are taxed without representation, right, as a territory. But like, where does it come in? So the Supreme Court ruled that territories like Puerto Rico are foreign in a domestic sense. This is legalese. What it means is for the purpose of, say, taxes on oranges. Puerto Rico is not American. However, if somebody attacks Puerto Rico, they are American. So they kind of create this like limbo system that a lot of territories, including Puerto Rico, are still in today. That they're somewhat American, but they're not American. Like they still are technically part of the United States in terms of foreign policy, but then like they can't vote for president. They can send representatives to Congress, but those representatives can't do anything but watch. Like they don't have any power. So this creates this like permanent limbo for these new territories. And while some of these territories we're talking about today do become independent, for example, the Philippines becomes an independent nation in 1946. Hawaii and Alaska become states in 1959. Puerto Rico, Guam, and American Samoa are all places that are still territories. And in the case of American Samoa, if you're born in American Samoa, unlike if you're born in Guam or Puerto Rico, still today, you have to apply for U.S. citizenship. You are not considered a natural born citizen like you would be in other territories. And in fact, the Supreme Court heard a case about this last year and decided not to fix this. Okay, so this creates a question. Are we still a republic, or are we an empire? Because in a republic, right, everybody has a right to representation in government, right? That was one of the things we revolted against the British for, right? No taxation without representation. But yet we have a sizable chunk of people living in these territories that don't have that, right? So like, how can we be a republic if we have these people who don't? And like, even if you think about it, DC, Washington, DC, is also in a similar thing where they're part of the United States, but their people don't have representation in Congress, right? So that's a reason why DC statehood, there's a bill about DC statehood being introduced to Congress. I think it was last week it was introduced. So, and then there's questions about Puerto Rico. Will we introduce similar legislation and make Puerto Rico a state, right? So that's one of the things that Americans are struggling with. There's a class of Americans that say, well, these people aren't civilized, so therefore, of course, we shouldn't make them exactly the same as us in political power. And there are other people who are saying we're hypocrites for denying this group of people the same rights that we enjoy as Americans. So that's kind of the tension of the United States, right? We claim to be this representative form of government, and yet we have all of these people living in territories still today that don't have the same rights as those of us who live in the States. For example, someone from Puerto Rico can move to the mainland and all of a sudden they can vote, right, for president. They can vote for, you know, the taxes that control them, and they can't if they went back home. And on that rather depressing note, I would like to say it gets better, but we're going to wait and see on that. We're still pending. I will go ahead and end the recording. Does anybody have any questions?